Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Perry Worldhouse. I'm Marie Harf, the Executive Director here at Perry Worldhouse. It's really nice to see all of you here. For those of you who've been to a number of events here over the past year, we've talked a lot in our programming about how last year was the year of democracy. Nearly 2 billion people, more than ever before, were eligible to perform their basic democratic right to cast a vote. But in the aftermath of the year of democracy, or the year of the voter, what have we seen so far in 2025, and what can we expect going forward? I mean, open up any news website, or X, for those of you still on it. You can see around the world political repression of civil society movements, information manipulation and propaganda, and the rise or consolidation of autocratic leaders around the world. All worrisome signs of realities some had hoped or believed belonged to the past. What can history teach us about these recent developments in worldwide democratic rule? Are these movements irreversible? If not, how can we make progress in rolling back some of this authoritarian movement? And what role should media play in keeping democracy alive and well? Both traditional media, online media, social media, all of the above. To answer these questions and many more, I am very excited to introduce you to our distinguished guests today. First, Ruth Ben-Ghiat is Professor of History and Italian Studies at New York University, one of the country's foremost scholars of autocracy. She's also a talented communicator who makes plain the threats facing democracies worldwide. This is something we talk a lot about here. We can see the threats, but how do you communicate them? How do you convince people that these are important and that they matter? Her latest book, Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present, examines how authoritarian leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and how resistance to them has unfolded over a century. She testified to the House January 6th committee and advises civil society organizations, including churches and multinational corporations facing autocratic interferences in the US and worldwide. She has a history of working with civil society groups to do just that. Our moderator today is my friend, Dean Sarah Benet-Weiser. She's the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication here at Penn, and it's Lauren Berlant Professor of Communication. She's also Research Professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, and the founding director of the Center for Collaborative Communication at the Annenberg Schools. Her teaching and research interests include gender in the media, identity, citizenship and cultural politics, consumer culture and popular media, race in the media, and intersectional feminism. She also co-leads our democracy pillar of work with political science professor Sarah Bush here at Perry Worldhouse, so is really invested in our democracy work here as we build out that piece of our research. She's committed to intellectual and activist conversations that explore how global media politics are exercised, expressed, and perpetrated in different cultural contexts. She's also authored or edited 8 books. I would encourage you to read all of them. Now, please help me welcome them to the stage. I would. They're all in my office.
Thank you all.
Can you hear me okay?
Great. So I'm very pleased to be here and speak to you all. I'm going to start with a personal story about my mother, who became radicalized by watching Russia Today. So my mother is still alive, a product of the Scottish working class. Always had a lot of common sense. She's a lifelong conservative. What? You want me to lift the microphone? No, lower it. Go, okay. Yeah, I get it. Okay, let's adjust the mic. Is that better? That's better, right? Okay, and I'll stand. All right, I'll start over. So my mother was a lifelong conservative who loved the Queen and had no patience for outlandish ideas or what she called flights of fancy. But during the pandemic, locked down in her village in northwest England, in Cheshire, my mother discovered the Kremlin propaganda channel Russia Today, and she became radicalized. She watched it hours a day. Her politics transformed from conservative to extremist. During our frequent phone calls, she started to parrot conspiracy theories about immigrants. She also developed a rabid hatred of U.S. President Joe Biden, while defending everything her new hero, Russian President Vladimir Putin, said and did. When they met, the two leaders, in June 2021, they met in Geneva, she complained, "Biden's doing nothing to help Putin." I almost fell off my chair. When Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, she repeated Russian talking points that he'd been provoked by NATO, that it was Biden's fault. I told her over and over again that this was Kremlin propaganda, but she said, "No, the hosts are British. This is a British show. What are you talking about?" And she just couldn't see the program as foreign. She couldn't arrive there. Now, of course, I'd been working as her daughter personally on these issues for many years. Indeed, I taught here in 2019 at the Annenberg School a course on propaganda. So, and she knew this, and so I started to send her things that I, her daughter, had written. But she just dismissed me and the work as, quote, fake news. So she was gone. So at first, and I know many people, I'm sure some of you here have relatives or community members you just can't talk to anymore. So what do? So first, I would hang up on her. When she would go into her anti-immigrant rants, I would just hang up. I couldn't deal. And then I said, what am I doing? I myself know this isn't what you're supposed to do. You don't hang up. That's not, they just go further into their tribes. So then I tried to speak with her. I visited her more often. The change came when Russia Today was banned in England. And so over time, and this is the lesson here, over time, she stopped talking about Putin, because she'd never, I have to say, Putin was never mentioned. It was the Queen who was always mentioned, but not Putin. She didn't care about Putin until she did. So she stopped talking about Putin. She stopped hating Biden so much. She didn't talk about him. But there was a lasting effect. Her views had shifted way to the right on immigrants who were blamed for everything. It's too small. England is too small to have immigrants. And that remained. So there was a lasting effect of the Kremlin propaganda in getting her to feel more hostile to those around her. So that's a lesson about the power of disinformation, and it's why this conference that has occasioned me coming here is so valuable. So as authoritarianism spreads across the world, and there's, whether it's Freedom House or the VDEM Institute, has found that up to 70% of the global population is living under some form of a liberal governance, and it's a continuum between degraded democracies up to like a North Korea. And as this spreads, so do the silences, the bans on knowledge, and the mysteries that can never be solved, that give rise to ignorance, fear, and anguish. Propaganda requires noise and silence in equal measure. You have to blare the lies, get as many people involved in the lies, ideally repeating the lies. And these are transnational circuits, as my mother's experience shows. But you also have to have silence. People must be silenced. And today's authoritarians, like those of the past, remove and eliminate people, but they also remove and limit access to fields of knowledge, entire fields of knowledge, that conflict with their goals. So think about in Hungary, Viktor Orban banned gender studies in 2018. And that was a prelude to him declaring in 2020 that bureaucratically intersex and trans people could not exist in Hungary. So often, knowledge and bans on knowledge and also universities and centers of knowledge are the prelude to other kinds of things. So just remember that. It's about noise, but it also is about silence. So we're in the middle of this giant silencing that's going on. From suppressions of climate change science, that's a universal with autocrats, to growing restrictions on the use of historical archives in Saudi Arabia and Russia. In here, since President Trump came in, the head of the National Archives was let go. So gaining access to free and fair information that could lead people to vote in free and fair elections is becoming increasingly problematic. So sciences are expanding because authoritarian leaders and their enablers have more to conceal. Newer governments are committing repressions as they consolidate their power, such as Bukele in El Salvador or Venezuela, where we just had Maduro in a self-coup where he lost the election and he wouldn't leave. And he's using repression to make sure people are too intimidated. Other leaders are proving the maxim that the longer such governments are in power, the more corrupt they become. And that's why the leaders become more paranoid and they crack down more. So you have, excuse me, more violence, more censorship, and more information manipulation required to keep the secrets buried and to keep the facade of competency. They want to be seen as competent, and in order to, the train's running on time, back to Mussolini. They want to be seen as efficient. They might even found a Department of Government Efficiency. But behind this is often corruption, is incompetence. So these dynamics get redoubled if authoritarians are also navigating an economic downturn or preparing for a risky war or getting more involved in an existing war. So there are these patterns to when they up their information manipulation and repression of information. So these tactics I've described are part of this broader authoritarian playbook that today's leaders use to wreck democracies and maintain themselves in power. And there's a concept that's very important called the authoritarian bargain. And this is when leaders make these kind of deals with elites. They can be financial elites, religious elites, of course, political and party elites, that they need those elites to legitimize their corrupt and violent regimes and their lying. So they have to be outwardly loyal. In return, they get part of the spoils, or they get legislation passed that's going to benefit them. So that's the authoritarian bargain. And the one with religious institutions is extremely important because the more corrupt they become, the more they require holy people, the holy men, to kind of have an aura of semi-divinity. So I have a chapter in my book about this, that they're sent by destiny to save the nation, the idea of the savior. And that can be a secular thing, but like from economic distress or Marxist, insurgency. But they're saved when you can say that, when you can get priests or imams or whatever faith it is, because it doesn't matter what the faith is, when you can get them to say that you're there by the will of God or by some kind of destiny to save the nation, that is very convincing to people. So it's a legitimation strategy. So this is part of what they do, as well as undermining the rule of law, undermining faith in elections, so discrediting democracy, discrediting the press, democratic institutions is very, very important. Destroying the ability to be held accountable, that is key. The dream of the autocrat is impunity, to be above accountability, to stay in office as long as you want, to be able to change the Constitution like Putin did, to stay till 2036, or to never have a successor. It's dangerous to even think about a successor, much less talk about it in public. So they do the same things. They purge the state bureaucracies of non-loyalists. This is called hollowing out of institutions, so that the institution can stay, but it performs in ways that help the leader. You make public office a vehicle for private profit. And this is a sad thing, that most authoritarians, they don't care about the people they're governing. They just couldn't care less. Often not only they don't care if you live or die, they do things that actively will help you to die, like send you into battle, or kill you, right? Or put you in prison. And so public office is not about public welfare, it's about amassing private power and private profit. And to this end, they also build personality cults. Very important, the personality cults, like the anchor that says that I am the man of the people, but I'm also the man above all other men. And that connects back to the kind of the savior of the nation. And this is why when you go through the history of authoritarianism, they target the same groups over and over again. And journalists and investigative journalists are part of this. LGBTQ people, religious minorities, right? Nomadic peoples, the same groups are targeted throughout the world. Anybody who engages in evidence-based work, anybody who's the wrong skin color, the wrong faith, they are targets. So an interesting thing, because this was a conference on the media, today's states that are concerned with rising opposition, they no longer stop only at silencing present-day critics. You jail them, you force them into exile, so they just can't publish. They can't get the news out. Individuals associated with past dissent also have to be contained so that future generations will ideally never know that there was resistance. And so the Chinese have been doing this in Hong Kong. When they cracked down in 2019, they didn't only arrest or force into exile the dissidents of the moment. Many of them were young, and many of them are now in London. They arrested the people who were dissidents from the 1980s and the 1990s, so that all public discourse about resistance would be quashed, and that new generations coming up would never hear about resistance, ideally. And that's scary. That's a kind of, authoritarians think long term, and they think in terms of engineering, information engineering, population engineering. And so this is also why they rewrite history, to justify their political control in the present and justify future erasures. So they erase the past to create a climate that makes for complicity when they're erasing in the present, and the idea that people won't know things in the future, right? And this is why so many of today's authoritarians are praising past leaders and they're rehabilitating past regimes. And it tends to be the ones, terribly, who succeeded the best at large-scale repression. So we have Vladimir Putin. He's creating Stalin study centers. So he's rehabilitating Stalin. There are statues going up to Stalin. We have Bolsonaro, who tried his hardest to be rehabilitating the Brazilian dictatorship, saying the coup was a good thing. We have Mr. Chainsaw. Well, there's many Mr. Chainsaws now, actually. So Javier Milei, reminiscing about the junta in Argentina. And we have the co-founder of the governing Brothers of Italy party and current president of the Italian Senate, Ignazio La Russa, saying, we are all heirs of Il Duce. He's the president of the Italian Senate. His co-founder, who's the Prime Minister Meloni, is a bit more cagey about this. If no national dictator is available in your history, a favorite foreign strongman will do. So President Trump has been associating himself with Xi, with Putin, with Orban, saying that these are the role models that we should have. These are the strong men. So the ultimate goal of autocrats is to have enough power, to gain enough power, to have monopoly on who can tell the stories. And ideally, all of you would be in their narrative world and not be telling your own stories. And so part of the problem is when they're telling the fire hose of falsehood, which is the Kremlin model that's been exported, a high volume flow of half-truths, total lies, insinuations, you can get into a point where if you're a beleaguered Democratic politician, you're just refuting all the time. So you're telling their story, you're in their narrative frame, and you're not telling your own story. This is a problem. And many opposition haven't figured out what to do about this. So the other thing is, the big story is who is a patriot and who is a criminal. And we're struggling with this in the United States. Now that President Trump is in office, the government can institutionalize its narratives about the January 6th insurrection, which was a self-coup attempt. A self-coup, autogolpe, is when you're in office and you're trying to stay there. You lose an election, but you try and stay there. illegally. And so they're now depicting it as a patriotic act. So one of the things that they've taken over the Kennedy Center, a temple of high culture, and who were one of the first groups they programmed into appearing there? It's the January 6th Prisoners Choir. And this kind of gives an aura of holiness around these are the people who are now pardoned, but were perpetrators of the violence of January 6th, and they went to prison. And in prison, they formed this choir. So now they are performing at the Kennedy Center. They are heroes. So who is a patriot? Who is a criminal? Who is a hero? The narratives around this change when you're in a situation of damaging democracy and creating autocracy. Ultimately, if you get to a place like Putin, only one or a narrative is available. Everybody else is already, or they will be imprisoned or killed. Okay, how am I doing on time? Do we know? Because that's not really. We like 5 minutes? Okay. So I do want to say, because I'm sure the United States now is really on the forefront of this clash between tyranny and freedom, which is going on globally. And the election was very close, but the Democratic opposition, as they are now, known in global terms, did not win. The GOP has been transformed over the last years into an essentially autocratic party. I'm saying this as a historian of authoritarianism. And this not only places American democracy at risk, but because of the negation of the climate crisis, because of upholding institutionalized racism, because of its anti-science and public health, it places all of us in danger. And often, when authoritarians embrace anti-science, conspiracy theories, it impoverishes and weakens populations. So 1/3 of House Republicans, and this was during the Biden years, were election deniers. And we hear this phrase a lot, but election denial is not just an act of propaganda. It's saying a lie and refuting a fact. It's actually an act of corruption. And so corruption is a very underused framework in the United States, but it's important. It's an act of institutionalized lying. When a whole party embraces a certain fiction, it's called institutionalized lying. And you need that to get your lie believed. You need everybody, all the troops have to go on all the networks and say the same truth, especially, and the bigger the lie, the more you need them to do that. So it's quite astounding that they were able to convince tens of millions of Americans that a very verifiable fact, who won the 2020 election in a very large country, they've been able to convince people of a fiction. And on that basis, that's like the foundational fiction for the Trump era, because without that, there's no justification for January 6th and the victim persona, all of that. Okay, so I just want to go toward the conclusion. And really, the tragedy of what's happening here is that elsewhere, authoritarianism is being exposed as a kind of unsustainable model of governance. And the reason that autocrats are working together more closely is that individually they're weaker, and we can discuss this. And, you know, a lot of the studies on whether democracy or autocracy is better for the economy, autocracies don't offer any real economic advantage over democracies. And it's difficult because they also cook the books. They hide the statistics, right? China, as it's had its economic downturn, its statistics have gone far more dark. That's typical. So the combination of plunder of human resources, economic resources, natural resources, the murderous wars many of them wage or are planning to wage, adds up to an awful truth that strongmen don't just endanger democracy, but they pose an existential threat to humanity. That's how I feel about it. So I want to end on a more hopeful note. So we're living through this. I've described this. again, 70% of the population is under some kind of autocratic leaning or autocratic rule. However, much less covered in the media, we're also living through a renaissance of global nonviolent mass protest since about 2019. And this constitutes, it's not all these protests are about authoritarianism. They're upset with democracy. They're upset with inequality, with racism, with climate, inaction on climate. However, they constitute a systematic and global reaction to plunder and to kind of arrogance as it trickles down. So many countries are seeing the biggest demonstrations they've had in decades or ever in their history. That was the case with the Chilean protests in 2019. We ourselves in the United States had two of our world record-breaking protests. We had the 2017 Women's March, biggest in the history, only to be surpassed by 2020 Black Lives Matter demonstrations, where about 20 million people, multiracial, multi-generational, participated in an event. It was the largest in history, and both of them had electoral outcomes. Many people were empowered and inspired to run for office, and that was reflected in the midterms, 2018, 2020, 22. So, and then the protests in Iran, even places where it's very dangerous to protest, women cutting their hair, Venezuela. There's something going on in the world. Because authoritarianism is spreading, there is this counter-reaction, and we need to cover it as such. It's very, very important. And I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hey everyone, can you hear me okay? Is it too loud? Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a little feedback. Yeah. Someone must be monitoring the communications in this building. Thanks so much for these incredible comments. I have lots to say. I'm just going to give a couple of thoughts and questions, and then we'll open it up for comments or questions from all of you. So I also know your work. I know that you talk. Thank you. That you talk about the kind of role that morals and moralizing play in all of this. And when you were, talking about containing history, rewriting history, institutionalized lying, fake news, all that, they don't work on their own, right? They actually need some kind of affective or moral framework in order to convince, people that something that they have thought about or been convinced of their entire lives is suddenly not true, right? Like your mom, And so I'm wondering if you could talk about the emotional communication element of the strongmen or authoritarianism, and also I think about this a lot because I think that at least in the United States, the extreme right has been able to harness emotional communication in a way that's much more effective than progressives or extreme left, in part because there's it's about performance, and it's about a certain kind of joy, even if it is a mask for hate and cruelty. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of emotional communication, the role of morals in the kind of elevation of the strongmen, or just the normalization of authoritarianism.
So a lot of the kind of strongman personality, they're very effective, and this has been going on since Mussolini and Hitler, at posing as the rogues, the people who are going to take on the establishment, the people who are going to be the truth tellers, who are going to do things that others don't have the guts to do. They're going to shake up everything. And this has been extremely effective. And even when they're in office, they are extremely good at using emotions to connect with people. So and this is the right or the left, it doesn't matter. They establish their personality cults because that gives them a kind of unmediated contact with people. People feel that they're being spoken to. Or they have the rallies. Chavez had a call-in radio show. People want to feel they can connect personally with the leader, and the leader is actually embodying their aspirations. And so an important thing is when we look at in history when authoritarians have an appeal, there's a pattern to it. It's often when people feel that society's been changing very rapidly. And here gender is important, as is race, that women are getting more power, that workers' rights are threatening stability of employers, that LGBTQ today, that's a today thing. It's, how can we have, same-sex marriage? So when these things happen and people feel threatened, they feel, and in Euro-American context, it's been white male threatened, and they feel like they're losing their authority. That's when they can be vulnerable to the siren song of the strongman, who comes up and acts as the rogue and says, I'm going to tell you, you don't have to be contained in your behavior. Like Trump in his first administration partly decriminalized domestic violence. And they attract often young men, but not only, also lots of women, who feel that some kind of different kind of governance is necessary. So this is part of it. And then they use emotions very, very effectively also because they know how to use the latest communication strategies. Mussolini used newsreels. Hitler used the radio. And the Nazis invested in sound technology. They've always been, Germany was like one of the leading engineering places, sound. So they invested in sound technology that would make Hitler's voice reverberate more at rallies. So there's the godliness. Modi, check out Modi's Instagram. He's like the most followed leader in the world. He's incredible at communicating. He used holograms when he first ran for office. So he was there as a hologram, and he was also in 100 places. Trump used Twitter, Bolsonaro used Twitter, Bukele is a genius with these things for his following. They all know how to use whatever is now in their time, and then they communicate in an emotional manner. And Democrats have not, with a small d, they're struggling to catch up, frankly.
So do you think, I'm a media scholar, so I'm especially interested in what you just said about the media and also your hopeful note at the end about the sort of reckoning that is happening across the world, and maybe mass protests are going to be something that actually, kind of mobilizes and galvanizes a resistance to the 70% of the world who lives under authoritarianism. What's the role of media in that? And I'm thinking about, we can see very clearly that if you're a billionaire and you own a platform, that if you own the mechanisms for the circulation of cruelty, of misinformation, of disinformation, of lies, if you own those mechanisms, then you can create, your communication, the kind of communication you want to circulate. How does that connect with people who want to resist this? What are the ways in which media can be harnessed and galvanized for those of us who want to say, who want to provide an alternative narrative? And I'm not talking about fact-checking, although that's important, but that's not working, right? I mean, it's not working in terms of stopping misinformation and disinformation and stopping the sort of normalization of violence that you're talking about. So how do we go about that?
So I guess there's two. One is with traditional media outlets, and again, some of them are not going to want to do this, to tell stories about the outcomes of authoritarianism. We hear how great they are, they're efficient. We don't hear about the brain drains, the economic plunder. They all go after businesses. It's not just Putin who goes after private business. It's Erdogan in Turkey. Erdogan gets a huge pass. So they plunder the economy, and they create scarcity, they create impoverishment, they create disease. When there's a crisis, the corruption is exposed, and then they have another round of repression. So that's something. Now, those are the exact things that the oligarchs buying the media properties don't want people to hear. But we're actually in a really interesting moment, which on the one hand, and this conference has been about that, the consolidation of social media platforms and the bending the knee of the Zuckerbergs and the Bezos has made it more difficult. But there's also the creator economy now. There's an individualization of communication through YouTube stars, through all of those things, through Substack newsletters. I don't know how many thousands there are now. And you can shut some of those the TikTok, you can try and shut them down. You can try and buy them out. But it's going to be very, very hard to silence all the individual creators. And this is a way, many people, for example, Jim Acosta, he's on Substack because they gave him, to silence him or force him to leave, they gave him a midnight to 2 a.m. slot. Well, no, he's not. So they're doing things like this, and there are parallels in other countries. But now, in some cases, some autocrats have tailored their repression. And Erdogan, what does he do? He does these things called insult suits for ordinary people. We're talking like 150,000 people have had insult suits. Social media posts you don't like, the government sues you. And so it's interesting that as communications has become more individualized, the autocrats have resorted to suing more individuals, not just major dissidents. We're talking about like whoever, like a butcher in Ankara. It doesn't matter. So that's one. We're in a period of transition, basically. That's what I would say.
One more question, then I'll open it up to everyone. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about this individualism, and especially kind of creator culture. I struggle a lot in thinking in the last, 6 months at least, about whether or not a collective mobilization is, as it has been historically, the way to actually kind of impact social change, to create new norms, to create new dynamics of power, and to protect those who are othered in all the sorts of ways that you've outlined. Creator culture is very individualistic, and it is about individual self-brands and individual politics, and so it seems to me like insult suits I haven't heard this, is a very interesting way to go about it. Someone hurts your feelings, and so you sue them, right? And that becomes the stuff of politics, and so I wonder how, again, to go back to the media, like how do we think about a more collective response rather than an individualistic response? I mean, it seems to me that part of the veneration of the strong man is because they are an individual that has been touched by divinity, or has been, risen above the rest, or has some kind of superpower, that allows them to convince, millions of people that they are right. And so, how do we challenge that kind of relentless individualism of authoritarianism?
Well, this is why I've been frustrated that we haven't seen the same coverage of this truly revolutionary, I mean that in terms of innovation, wave of nonviolent protest that's occurring all over the world. There's we could be entering a new anti-authoritarian age. Such is the magnitude of the protests. Even China, we're not hearing about it because of what China is, but during the lockdown protests, 79 universities had protests, including the elite incubator where she went to school. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And the thing about nonviolent mass protests, and these were scattered protests, but they were and journalists were there, and they were recording and publicizing what people were saying. And there's a woman in Shanghai who said, I've been wanting to say this out loud for so long. So whether it's a small protest that gets covered, or it's a mass protest, it allows people to feel empowered, and it's so important, because authoritarians do everything, and I've mentioned many of the things, to make us feel helpless and hopeless and outnumbered, when often they are a minoritarian, and they're a group of gangsters, frankly, who seize power and stay there for a very long time, through violence, through lying, etc. And so that's why nonviolent mass protest, as in Chile in the 1980s, as many in Myanmar, where they were very smart after they had the military coup in 2021, they reached people with memes. The young people did economic boycotts. They invented apps so people could know in real time which businesses were colluding with the junta. And through this initial in-person protest plus digital stuff, they created an actual resistance movement that then became an armed resistance movement, which is one of the most innovative and successful, along with Ukraine, civilian resistance and urban warfare, in the world. So things are going on, and we're not having the narratives that put these things together that give hope, that the world can go in a different direction. We're really at a crossroads. Instead, we hear only the other side, that I'm a part of telling the other side, right? We have to know, but there's this whole other stuff going on, and it's really important. The last thing I'll say is, definitely social media is a double-edged sword, but it can be used, and this goes to your question about individual creators. For example, when there were the protests in Moscow in 2019, there's a cycle of cracking down, right? Putin cracks down. Navalny's allies and people associated with his movement, they live streamed people coming to knock on their door and arrest them. And if you study resistance, this is like the paradigmatic moment. The police arrive, knock on your door, and away you go. In the past, when I started studying things in the 30s, this was private. I mean, your neighbors would see, but you dragged into the horrible black van. But what they did was they live streamed the whole thing. The police coming to the door, and one of them refused to get out of her chair, and so they live streamed her. The police had to carry her down in her chair, and this created a sensation. And what this does is create like horizontal communities who are emotionally involved. So, which is why, of course, autocrats then try and shut those platforms down. But they can't shut them down all the time for everyone. Some do, North Korea. So it's a double-edged sword, but it's not just that it's happening, we have to cover it. We have to encourage people to cover it at the local level as well as the national level.
Yeah, well, as the dean of the Annenberg School for Communication, I'm going to say I wholeheartedly agree with you about not only just covering it from a journalistic point of view, but also understanding that culture is a capacious field, and those things that you brought up, memes and live streams, but also joy and hope to combat some of the hate and cruelty that happens in culture. Right? Yeah. We're seeing, it doesn't happen in a kind of more formal political realm in a way that actually, can give us hope. And so I love, kind of your thoughts about really focusing on culture as the space for possibility, as the space that is always going to be ambivalent. It's not going to be just, kind of rising up in terms of joy and hope, and it's also not going to be absolute devastation, and we need to remember that. We need to remember how rich a cultural terrain is for exercising resistance in politics. So thank you for that. I'm going to, right here and then there.
Okay. Hi, Trudy Woodburn from the Philadelphia Inquirer, but I'm also a visiting fellow at Perry Wildhouse. And I just want to follow on what you've just been discussing about the use of social media in politics. I had the privilege of interviewing Navalny several times, and I've spent time in Russia. And social media was his strategy. So it was a strategy and a message behind it. And it was to empower young people out in the boonies to say the government is screwing you over and you've got to join us and fight back. And I was just in Germany during the elections, and the AfD, the neo-Nazi party, although they deny that, also made incredible use of mass media with young people and with an older audience. And there was a strategy behind it, a mass strategy, and the rest of the German parties have not caught up with this. And as you said, Trump has that strategy down pat, and he also has the platforms now under him. So what I'm wondering is, if you're the Democratic Party, or if you're the CDU or the SPD, in Russia the game is over for now. I mean, you can reach people individually, but there's no more mass movement. But how do you concoct a strategy that scales up, that reaches out to people with a widespread message but tailored to individual states or cities or groups? Because if you can't fight back on a large scale with social media, you're going to be beaten if you just try to do it locally.
I think definitely Democrats have been, with a small d, much more hesitant about using emotions. The exception was Poland in 2023, where they had the March of a Million Hearts, literally a heart emoji, which is very popular, was their symbol. And they had the largest rally since 1989 and the largest electoral turnout to defeat the far right. So they both had a kind of sweeping optimism of national things, and they also had, like, you know, appeal to not have the few abortion rights they had left be gone. They exposed corruption, but they did it locally as well. They told stories about how this was affecting people locally, and we know that that's what moves people. Like, talking about democracy is too abstract. You have to make it come home to people. And so local media, it has to do that, and we have a big problem because a lot of this have been bought out by, you know, syndicates that don't want you to do that. But that's part of it. The other thing, just as a general thing, I see a lot of, because there's such an aggression from successful authoritarian movements, a lot of parties around the world have sought refuge in moving to the center and becoming so moderate that they don't stand for anything anymore, and they keep losing elections when they do that. So having a values-driven politics is really important, like standing for something, right? So, you know, and this harmed the Biden, who was the first president on a picket line and did so many progressive things, created huge numbers of jobs, but also had the largest amount of drilling. You know, the oil production was at a record high, so not exactly fossil fuel, and you know, was supporting Netanyahu while he was doing things in Gaza. So these were things that appeared to people as hypocritical. And so having a consistent values-driven and communicating how it affects people locally, what you will get out of it locally, and not just being abstract, is really important. And that's like a global message. It's globally it can be implemented globally, is what I'm saying.
I'll just say something just very quickly on that. I also been thinking a lot about time lately, and one of the things about social media that we all know is that information circulates so fast, so quickly. There's a hot take here, there's a hot take here, and then something obscures what had just happened, and resisting that idea that social media is the timing, the temporality of social media is the way that we should do politics, I think is really important. It requires patience, which I don't have a lot of, but I do think that resisting the norms of social media as if they are inevitable, as if we have to make decisions about politics within 10 minutes before the next thing comes around, as if there aren't other forms of communication, other forms of journalism, I think is really important.
Because Trump keeps repeating the same message no matter what.
Yeah. And everything is happening at once. We're at the University of Pennsylvania. Let me tell you, everything is happening at once. And there's a lot of, and sifting through that. Is this, creating that chaos and creating that confusion is the strategy. And so I think it's really important for us to resist that strategy and still think about how it is that we can understand these politics and create counter narratives. So, he has to say.
We know that historically dictators and leaders of coups first go after the radio stations, the television stations, and the newspapers. What we're seeing here more recently under Trump, aside from calling the press the enemy of the people, is that he's throwing out the New York Times, NBC, Politico, and some others from the press pool, AP for not calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and what we see are other news outlets bowing to Trump and self-censoring, which is even more dangerous, and I see that spreading among people like your mother. I'm less concerned about the people who voted for Kamala than I am about the others who are becoming true believers of Trumpism. Mm-hmm. What do we do here? How do we fight that back?
I think, there's a reason that they're doing that, the reason they've had great success so far by standardizing the message. And they had party unity. And what Trump did very effectively, whether you like it, you think it's great, or you don't, this is what he did. He imposed message discipline, and as the party became, shall we say, more unfriendly to people who were dissenting, they instituted things that are very familiar in authoritarian context, but were new. I don't know if you remember, after January 6, Ted Cruz, who'd been a really good warrior for Trump, he made a mistake. He called January 6 a domestic terrorist operation. Excuse me. And this was not allowed to stand. So Tucker Carlson, who still had his show, top-rated show, hauled him up, made him come on there, and berated him. And you could see the fear in Ted Cruz's eyes because his status as a senator meant nothing to Tucker Carlson. What mattered is that he had transgressed the party line. And they were so effective at ritual humiliation, which is what this is called, and other things they did to get party discipline, and that was then echoed on Fox and other networks. And again, when we talk about party discipline, it's not just the big senators, it's all the way down to the state representatives, their staffs, their own social media, a whole world of repeating the same messages. And so that's why they're doing this now. They need to get rid of any media outlet who's not going to show President Trump up to the greatest advantage. They don't want things filmed where there might be a question that is compromising. Because as you get more authoritarian, it's not just the answers that have to be standardized. Asking questions is dangerous. That's why journalists are sent to prison. That's why academics. You're troublesome if you ask questions. In fact, in 1939, Mussolini, who was a reporter, he was a journalist, he was a brilliant, orator and journalist. He banned the use of question marks in titles for the national press because you weren't supposed to have any doubt. You had to be certain, right? So questions are dangerous. So they're cleansing things so that when other things happen, whatever they have planned, they will get the coverage that they want, and the leader will be seen in the way he wants to be seen. That's why Putin now got rid of his press conferences and he has a call-in show where it's all very staged and he's alone and he can be just like he wants to be. So,
just to add, I think you're absolutely right. I think that we need to think about why so many people voted in this direction, and actually not moralize. I mean, there's some people certainly that we could moralize about, but a lot of people voted because of actual pain. Because they're grieving, or they can't feed their family, or they don't know what's happening. And so rather than moralize about that, I think we need to, this could be me being Pollyannish, me wanting us to be able to do something, but we need to actually enter into an age that is more about understanding why it is that so many people feel aggrieved in particular ways, yes, and then work to make sure that the blame is targeted at the right people. So instead of being targeted at women or at immigrants or at laborers, there's a way in which we need to kind of recognize that decision to vote in that direction made sense. It wasn't just because someone was an idiot or someone was, not thinking straight. It was a real reason. And let's think about what that real reason is. If we don't do that, I don't see how we can actually have communication across that particular divide.
How do you do it when they're controlling the media and they're suing the media? The media is giving in to them because they're afraid.
Well, but it's not North Korea or China. There's a lot of space. Yeah. No, but we're here now. And the lesson of authoritarianism and resistance, you use the spaces you have when you have them. Very important. Yes, some people are providing a dispiriting spectacle of obeying in advance. Often the people who would have the resources to not care, they're the ones who are folding, and it's always been like that. But people have created their own spaces for pushback and their own circuits of communication. Think about, like, in Argentina, there's a whole history of mothers resisting, and when there have been people who have been disappeared, the mothers of the plaza, and they come out, and they did this in Chile also, and they had pictures of their children or husbands who had been disappeared, and they put them in people's faces. They left them on bus stops. They put them. And that's very effective. And that's something that's very small scale, but it's been repeated as a tactic. So we should never think that because something is on a bad trajectory, we shouldn't use the spaces we have now, because then those spaces might not be available in a year, and we will have missed an opportunity. This is the optimist. I am an optimist. I want to say that. I work on horrible people and horrible things, but I am an optimist because I also study resistance, and there are lessons from that, and we can apply those lessons now.
Before we get to this last question, as a journalist from the Philadelphia Inquirer, can you tell us how we do that?
A couple of things.
She allowed me to put her on the spot, just in case you
No, you may not know this, but we had a good billionaire named Jerry Renfest, who owned our newspaper and set it up as he was dying so that we are owned by a nonprofit, so we cannot be sold to some avaricious crook. That does not mean that we don't have to break even, but I think the Inquirer, and I will give a plug to my own paper, The Inquirer has stood up to all this. I am never told what to write. Will Bunch, who writes on domestic affairs, is never told what to write. And so I can only make a plug to you, because we have to survive financially. They have not yet brought a lawsuit against us, but I think, lawsuits are going to be the technique against all newspapers who speak out. So support, if you have a local newspaper like the Inquirer, because we are willing to keep fighting. I think the New York Times will go to the mat. Poor Washington Post, you know that story. But I think it's also up to readers to try to support those media who keep standing up.
And remember, yes. Also remember local media. There's lots and lots of local media, local journalism that is dedicated to telling these stories in a way that isn't about getting seen on X or something like that.
Can I say, the other thing is, when you understand the strategy behind it, even if something happens, it's less scary because it's understandable. I was named in 2022, Trump sued CNN for $475 million or something. And the claim was that people at CNN were comparing him to Hitler. He didn't like that at all. And 3 people were named in the suit: Jake Tapper, Chris Talitza, who's no longer there, and me. And I don't have a contract. I was of all the thousands of op-eds that CNN published, it was an op-ed that I did as a freelancer about Trump's big lie, about how the 2020 election lie worked because he had set up a narrative frame, and he had done certain things for years, and it went through. As a historian of propaganda, and of all the things, that's the one they picked, right? Now, I wasn't personally sued, and a Trump-appointed judge dismissed it in 2023, so nothing happened. But very clearly, this was designed to not only intimidate CNN, but me, so that I wouldn't write anymore. And so you have to kind of both factor these things in, that this may happen, but also understanding why they're doing it, for me, has been a comfort. That there's a strategy behind it, and it just redoubles my resolve to have other people understand the strategy and keep explaining, right? So that's also to answer your question. Things can happen and things will happen, but we can be prepared if we have knowledge.
Yeah. We are just about out of time, so I thank you so much for your incredible insights and talking with us. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for supporting nonprofit journalism.